Genesis 42, Bible Study Script KJV. Joseph's brothers go down to Egypt. Hello, everyone. Today we will study Genesis chapter 42, verses 1 through 38, from the King James Bible. This passage is part of the larger story of Joseph, one of the most powerful and providential narratives in the entire Bible. To understand Genesis 42 correctly, we must first remember the background. Joseph, the son of Jacob, was hated by his brothers because their father loved him deeply. Out of jealousy, the brothers sold Joseph into slavery in Egypt. Joseph suffered greatly. He was falsely accused, imprisoned, and forgotten. However, God was working behind the scenes. Through God's providence, Joseph eventually became the governor of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. God used Joseph to prepare Egypt for a great famine that would spread across the entire region. Genesis 42 begins when that famine finally reaches the land of Canaan. This chapter shows us how God brings people to repentance, how he restores broken families, and how his providence works even through suffering. Let us now walk through the passage step by step. The famine reaches Canaan. Genesis chapter 42, verses 1 through 5. Jacob learns that there is grain in Egypt. The famine has become severe, and people everywhere are struggling to survive. Jacob says to his sons, "Why do you look one upon another? Behold, I have heard that there is corn in Egypt." So Jacob sends 10 of his sons to Egypt to buy grain. But he does not send Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, because he fears harm might come to him. Here we see an important detail. Jacob still carries the pain of Joseph's loss. Even after many years, the wound has not healed. From a Hebraic perspective, family lineage and inheritance were extremely important. Losing a son was not only emotionally devastating, but also socially significant. Jacob's fear reveals a father still living in grief. But behind the human story, God is already moving his plan forward. The brothers who once sold Joseph into slavery are now unknowingly traveling toward the very man they betrayed. This is a powerful example of divine providence. Sometimes people believe that their sins are hidden forever, but God has a way of bringing truth to light in his perfect timing. 2. Joseph recognizes his brothers. Genesis chapter 42, verses 6 through 17. When the brothers arrive in Egypt, they bow down before Joseph. Without realizing it, they fulfill the dreams Joseph had many years earlier. In Genesis 37, Joseph dreamed that his brothers would bow before him. Now that prophecy becomes reality. Joseph immediately recognizes them, but the brothers do not recognize Joseph. Why? Because Joseph now looks like an Egyptian ruler, speaks through interpreters, and has lived in Egypt for many years. Joseph accuses them of being spies. At first glance, Joseph's actions may seem harsh, but spiritually, Joseph is doing something important. He is testing their hearts. Joseph wants to know whether his brothers have changed. Have they repented? Are they still capable of betrayal? This reveals a deep spiritual principle. God often allows situations that test our hearts, not because he does not know the truth, but because through testing, our hearts are revealed. 3. The brothers remember their sin. Genesis chapter 42, verses 18 through 24. Joseph places them in prison for 3 days. Then he tells them that one brother must stay in Egypt, while the others return home and bring Benjamin back. At this moment, something remarkable happens. The brothers begin to speak among themselves. "We are verily guilty concerning our brother." They remember Joseph. They remember how he cried out when they sold him. They remember their cruelty. This is the beginning of conviction. True repentance begins when people finally recognize their sin. From a theological perspective, this moment reflects the work of God's Spirit in the conscience. Years may pass, but guilt often remains buried in the human heart. God sometimes uses circumstances to awaken that conscience. Joseph hears their words and secretly weeps. Even though they hurt him deeply, Joseph's heart is still filled with compassion. This is a reflection of God's own heart. God does not delight in punishment. He desires repentance and restoration. 4. Simeon is taken. Genesis chapter 42, verses 25 to 28. Joseph keeps Simeon in Egypt. The other brothers are sent home with grain, but Joseph secretly returns their money into their sacks. When the brothers discover the money, they become afraid. They say, "What is this that God hath done unto us?" Notice something important here. For the first time, the brothers begin to recognize that God is involved in their circumstances. This is often how spiritual awakening begins. People start to realize that events are not random. God is working, sometimes through blessing, sometimes through confusion, sometimes through fear. God uses many methods to draw people back to Him. 5. Jacob's fear and grief. Genesis chapter 42, verses 29 through 38. When the brothers return home, they tell Jacob everything. Jacob becomes deeply distressed. He says, "Me have ye bereaved of my children." First Joseph was gone. Now Simeon is held in Egypt, and they are asking to take Benjamin as well. Jacob refuses. He says, "My son shall not go down with you." Jacob is overwhelmed by fear. But this moment reveals something important about faith. Even faithful believers sometimes struggle to see God's plan. Jacob cannot yet see that God is preparing something beautiful. God is preparing the reunion of Joseph and his family. God is preparing the preservation of Israel. God is preparing the path that will eventually lead to the coming of the Messiah. From a spiritual perspective, Genesis 42 teaches us a powerful truth. God's providence often works through situations that seem painful or confusing. But behind the scenes, God is leading history toward His greater purpose. Spiritual lessons from Genesis 42. First, God's providence is always at work. Even when Joseph was sold into slavery, God was guiding the story towards salvation. Second, sin eventually confronts the conscience. The brothers tried to forget what they had done, but their guilt returned years later. Third, God uses circumstances to bring repentance. Hard seasons sometimes become the doorway to spiritual transformation. Fourth, God's ultimate goal is restoration. Joseph does not seek revenge. Instead, God will use Joseph to restore his family. And in the same way, God works in our lives today. Even when we experience suffering, confusion, or waiting, God is still working. The story of Joseph reminds us that God's plans are always greater than our understanding. He sees the entire picture, and in His perfect timing, He brings redemption. Thank you for studying Genesis chapter 42 with me today. Thank you.